Hi Dhamma friends, today's video is in response to the question I got in a comment on one of my videos, the video on using the three perceptions as tools for awakening. And the question was, should we not believe in gods just because science say that gods don't exist? And we're talking about sort of the pantheistic gods, the polytheistic gods that exist in nature. And this question was actually in response to an analogy I use a lot to explain the perception of anatta, or non-self. An meaning non, it's a negative, and atta meaning self. So anatta means non-self, or not self. The analogy that I had used, which that question was based on, is that our ancestors used to believe that when they saw a storm gather, that it was the result of gods becoming angry. And then to control the fear and the anxiety that would arise based off that perception, our ancestors performed many rites and rituals to control the fear and the anxiety, to try to control the weather, essentially, right? A lot of human behavior, especially habitual behavior, behaviors based in belief systems or rules and rituals that we perform in our daily lives, are all the result of fears and anxieties that arise from misperceptions. So our ancestors had this perception of the gathering storm being the result of gods being angry, fear and anxiety based on that perception, rites and rituals based off that fear. Modern people with scientific knowledge don't generally look at a storm and see it as the consequence of anger. We don't personify the storm as a god becoming angry. We understand that storms arise due to natural causes and conditions, and because of that knowledge, the perception or the personification of gods doesn't happen, and then the anxiety and the fear that arises dependent on that perception doesn't arise. And then, of course, the rites and rituals dependent on that fear and anxiety don't arise. So we don't really organize our lives or have rites and rituals based off controlling the weather or appeasing angry gods anymore because of scientific knowledge. So that's kind of the analogy. And then about personification of nature. But I said also what we do is we personify internal nature, sensation, thought, feeling, memory, perception, right? These are internal natural processes that happen within the body-mind complex, and we personify that as well. We say, this is me, these are my thoughts, this is who I am, these are my feelings, this is who I am. And we develop a lot of fears and anxieties and insecurities and rituals and behaviors based off of that perception. So the perception of not self is a way of giving it all back to nature. And giving it back to nature helps us gain relief. Right? But the question was, can we believe in gods? Or should we not believe in gods just because of modern science? So I thought that was kind of interesting to bring up a whole separate point about the Dhamma, related point. And that is that Buddhism is not a metaphysical or ontological or system of philosophy. The Buddha doesn't make claims about what is objectively real, independent of our experience. He doesn't make claims about the nature of being, like an ontology. He doesn't take solid positions on metaphysics or ontology. Instead, he focuses teaching on phenomenology, to use some of the categories of Western philosophy. So phenomenology, if you're not familiar, phenomena means appearance. So basically, phenomenology is about experience. And philosophies that focus on phenomenology make the claim, or I guess you could point out that we can't be 100% sure of anything outside of experience. So whether the ontological or the metaphysical reality is that we are all inside the matrix, or that some like alien force created humans in vats, or that we were created by gods or by a single god, or that we arose due to the evolutionary process from the Big Bang through evolution here on Earth to what we are now, whether the universe is made of matter or consciousness or something completely different. None of that matters. None of that is seen as relevant in Buddhism, actually. The Buddha focused on seeing things in our experience through the lens of conditionality, understanding the causal arising specifically of dukkha, which is mental disturbance, ranging from boredom to depression, anxiety, all of the stuff, right? All of the sense of lack that we feel, the anxiety, the fear, the anger, the hatred, everything that leads to war and environmental degradation, the selfishness, and the fact that these things that we experience are a result of craving, which is greed, hatred, and delusion, and that craving is a result of ignorance, which is not seeing the Four Noble Truths, essentially not seeing the causal arising of dukkha through this process of perception. And that taking this process of perception personally and assigning an I, me, mine to this process of perception, taking the I feeling that arises out of experience as self, is the cause of, as the Buddha would say, this whole massive suffering. So related to whether or not we can believe in gods, the answer to that is that it's not a relevant question. People are welcome to have any kind of metaphysical belief that they want, or ontological belief that they want, or religious belief that they want. Although you can see that there are causes and consequences, causes and conditions to what we believe in our experience, right? So that's what you really want to look at. So there's a few suttas that help to highlight this, the response to this question. The Buddha didn't confirm or deny the existence of gods or goddesses. He didn't confirm or deny the existence of other worlds. He referenced, things like rebirth and other realms of existence because that was the discourse of his time, and he wasn't really seeking to take a position on those things. What he did do is, whenever he was questioned about this, he would take the speaker's attention back to the causal arising of dukkha in this moment here and now, right? So if you go to the Agi Vajjhagota Sutta, the Buddha is questioned and cross-questioned by a philosopher, essentially, about whether or not the Tathagata, which is a synonym for the Buddha, it's an epithet for the Buddha, exists or doesn't exist after death. And the Buddha basically says no to every single formation of the question that there is in all of Indian philosophy at the time. And the questioner is like, I'm confused, I'm perplexed. And the Buddha says, yes, of course you're confused. This is something you should be confused about, because this is the thicket of views. This is the wilderness of views, essentially. That to basically have a belief about things that we can't directly see and experience is a wilderness. It leads to confusion, it leads to conflict, and it doesn't, and he says specifically, going back to the sutta, it's not related to the goal. And then he recites the Four Noble Truths, seeing and understanding dukkha, abandoning the origin of dukkha, realizing a cessation, and developing a Noble Eightfold Path. Because that process of the Four Noble Truths is what leads to awakening, greater and greater and greater awakening, and eventually leads to liberation from the defilements and the taints. And when you have a mind that is blissful and peaceful and free, it doesn't matter if you believe in gods or goddesses or not, if you believe that the universe originated from a Big Bang or from a creator God. Those types of things are irrelevant questions in terms of Buddha Dhamma. In the Kalama Sutra as well, when he's being asked by the Kalamas about how to discern what's true knowledge and what's false knowledge and all these different belief systems, the Buddha says to the Kalamas famously that you shouldn't take anything that I say or anyone else says, whether it's written down or it's spoken or it's worshipped or whatever, in any situation, to be true unless it agrees with your own experience in terms of the goal, right? So if it leads to the cessation of dukkha, the arising of the Brahma Viharas, like loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity, clarity, insight, happiness. Because in Buddhism, the understanding is that true knowledge is knowledge. Well, it's not like necessarily defining true knowledge this way. It's basically pointing out a natural fact that when true knowledge is born in the mind, the suffering dependent on the false knowledge disappears. And I've used in the past, right? Like if you're in a dark room as a child and you see a monster on the wall, when the light turns on, the monster disappears, and the fear dependent on that perception of monster disappears because now you've seen that it was just a shadow cast by a coat rack. So that's the arising of true knowledge and the vanishing of the suffering dependent on the misperception. When you're walking down the road and you get afraid because you think you see a snake, and then you get closer and you see that it's a rope, when the arising of true knowledge that it's a rope comes into the mind, the false knowledge of snake and the fear dependent disappears. And then it's the same thing for this personification of nature, external and internal, and all of the conditioned arising of dukkha, of suffering, that comes from the lack of true knowledge. So the Buddha's always taking people back down to who cares about all of that metaphysical and ontological stuff. What we're worried about is the nature of our experience, of becoming free of dukkha. So what you can actually do is ask yourself why it's important to know whether or not there are or aren't gods, right, and goddesses, or whether it's important to know whether or not how the universe originated. All questions essentially that we have, if we look closely at them, they arise from a sense of fear, dissatisfaction. Fear and dissatisfaction, I would say, are the largest two defilements that these types of speculative questions come from. What's wrong with this experience that we need to layer it over with beliefs that we can't see and experience here and now? If you just take a moment to get quiet and just look at the nature of this experience now. Well, the one thing that you do know right now is that you are alive, you are aware, and you can take a look at this experience and see whether or not the body-mind is completely happy and satisfied, or it isn't. Is there dukkha or is there not dukkha? And that's why the First Noble Truth is so significant. It's the presence or absence of dukkha that's important, because the presence or absence of dukkha, it's like an indicator species. It tells us whether or not craving is present in the mind. So that craving is that fundamental dissatisfaction. It's that fundamental sense of lack that leads us to be chase after something, to run away from something, or to spin around in confusion, because the mind is so used to grasping at things it wants and pushing away things it doesn't want that when it encounters something neutral, it gets very confused about it. So those are the different ways that craving manifests in the mind, and dukkha is what arises from craving. And then, of course, craving goes back to ignorance. So that's pretty much the answer to the question about whether or not we can. So the short answer is yeah, you can, but you don't need to. What's the point? Does it aid you in the goal of liberating the mind? Because ultimately we're awakening to the nature of experience moment by moment in order to eventually completely liberate the mind from the arising of dukkha that's dependent on the craving that comes from the ignorance. And when the mind is completely awake, completely satisfied, and you look at the world with wisdom and compassion, these types of questions just really don't matter to you anymore. You just feel everything is fine just the way it is. Everything is okay. Everyone is a friend, right? So I hope that answers your question. And again, as usual, any additional questions, go ahead and put it in the comments. And like and subscribe if you feel so inclined. And thank you.